Sì, bene.
Eccoci qua. Iniziamo. Allora, oggi è una giornata intensa, abbiamo 2 seminari dell'Eurasia, per cui vi ringrazio per la vostra calorosa partecipazione. Oggi, per il seminario di oggi pomeriggio, come ospite abbiamo il professore Walter Bisang della Università Johannes Gutenberg University Mainz, dove insegna come docente, insegna linguistica generale, linguistica comparativa dal 1992. È un massimo esperto di linguistica, per cui siamo doppiamente contenti in quanto molti di voi avete già una formazione solida in linguistica. His research mainly, scusate, qui faccio in inglese. His research mainly explores the structural diversity of human language with a focus on grammaticalization, language context, classification systems, and the linguistic interface in East and Southeast Asian languages. He was also visiting professor at many important institutions in the world, including Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, La Trobe University in Melbourne, and the École des Hautes Études and Sciences Sociales in Paris. Professor Bisang has also played key roles in major research initiatives such as the Collaborative Research Center, Cultural and Linguistic Context. His lecture today, entitled Manifestations of Linguistic Complexity, East and Mainland Southeast Asia and Europe. It will be very important. It will offer rich insights into cross-regional linguistic patterns. Professore parla anche italiano, quindi eventualmente alla fine del suo seminario, se volete intervenire con domande, commenti, tranquillamente potete anche chiedere in italiano. Va bene? Lascio la parola al professore, grazie ancora per essere qui con noi, siamo molto felici.
Grazie per avermi invitato. È un gran piacere di essere qui in un'atmosfera simpatica, aperta, interessante. Allora, come ha già detto la collega, voglio presentare in inglese, ma dopo, se è necessario, possiamo continuare in italiano. È una lingua che mi piace e in questo senso non ho niente da obiettare se continueremo in italiano. Allora, but for now, let's start with my presentation in English. Manifestations of linguistic complexity. How does linguistic complexity manifest itself on the one hand in East and Mainland Southeast Asian languages and in European languages on the other hand? Well, let's first start with some preliminaries and let's just start with an example. The example is from a big novel written by Gao Xingjian, One Man's Bible in the English translation, Iger and the Shengjing in the Chinese original. He was the Nobel Prize winner of literature in 2000. But of course, we will not read the whole book. We will only look at a single little example, which you can see here, first in Chinese. Here you have the small passage I'm going to talk about. 他父亲并不赞成他成天守在屋里看书写字，认为男孩子就要攀平鞋，出去见世面，光脚迹闯天下，对当作家不以为然。So that's the original. And now the question is, what information do you actually find in that Chinese original? So the characters involved are the protagonist, the ego person writing the novel, the perspective of the protagonist, the son, and then there is his father, And then there is a statement about boys in general and how boys should behave. And the information you can get here, you can retrieve from what is said here is his. This is this ta here. Father, Fuqin, actually corresponds to Bing. Bu is not the negation. Cancheng is a proof. Ta is he. The whole day is Chengtian, and so on. And now you read the English version. His father actually not a proof. He, the whole day, spend in room, read, write, maintain. Boy then must be naughty a bit, go out, see world, widely socialize, force his way, world. As for become writer, not think so. So that is what is there in Chinese, not more. How do you make sense out of that? And that is the question I'm going to talk about. How much, and in particular grammatical information, do you need to provide in a language? Of course, Chinese has a lot of grammatical markers, but it doesn't use them in the same way, or often doesn't use them in the same way as it does in English or other standard average European languages, and actually also in many other languages. So the translation would be something like, his father did actually not approve that he, and now you have to infer who that he refers to. It refers to his, to the son, that he, the son, stayed at home the whole day. Then you have read, write, reading, writing, and you don't know who is doing that action, but you can infer that it must be the son. So father didn't approve that he, his son, stayed at home the whole day, reading and writing. But then there is another unmarked thing, maintained. But here it's not the son who maintains, it's the father, whose opinion is who maintains that, and now there is a generic expression, a boy or boys in general, should be somewhat naughty, remember that, go out, see the world, widely socialize, make his way into the world. And in fact, this other zero unmarked action could actually be boys in general, or it could be the son. We don't know, and it actually doesn't matter much for understanding what is meant. It is obvious that boys, or his own son included, somehow behave like that. As for being a writer, who is going to be a writer? Well, it could be a boy again, or it could be his son in particular, who is the novelist, of course. He disagreed, and the one who disagreed is the father again, but there is no marking of that. So you can see that there is a lot of marking, of difference in what you mark and what you don't mark. And one phenomenon which is particularly prominent here, but not only, is that Chinese is what is sometimes called a radical prodrop language. And there's a lot of literature on that, particularly also in the generative context, but by no means exclusively in the generative context. What does prodrop mean? Yeah, this means that you drop your pronoun, you don't mention it. So it's the omission of a noun or a noun phrase or a pronoun in the subject as well as in the object position. So there are certain non-prodrop languages like English. Mary sings is okay, she sings is okay, but sings alone without the pronoun there is obviously ungrammatical. Italian is, in my own personal terminology, a mild prodrop language because, as you know, of course, Maria canta, canta, canta lei, lei canta, but you can also just say canta. It's mild because, this is a mild prodrop language because you can still somehow retrieve the subject due to agreement rules. But then if you go to a radical prodrop language, which is in contrast to the mild prodrop language as we have it in Chinese, there is some information that you can retrieve from the verb, which is not the case in Chinese. So the subject is still present in the morphology in Italian, but there is nothing from which you can retrieve the subject. So if you have a simple sentence, I mean, the sentence as such doesn't need to be quoted because it's so simple, but given that this is the sentence by which Huang in his famous 1984 paper, introduced the whole topic. I'll quote him here for that example. You have 你昨天看了电影吗? That's the question. You yesterday see perfective marker film and then question marker ma. And the answer just is 看了. See perfective marker here. Which in a given context, the question is, did you see a film? Then the answer would most likely be, I saw it or one or whatever. But as you can see, the Chinese original here couldn't care less about pronouns here. There's just nothing. And that's an example of radical prodrop. In fact, if you look at the sentence again, you see that there is also other grammatical information. And I'm just talking about grammatical information missing or not expressed. Let me put it like that. It's not missing, it's not expressed. So there are other categories for which the language clearly has markers if needed, but they are not marked in this context. So his father actually negative, approve, he the whole day stay. Well, no tense marking here, for instance, at show. Then there is a preposition, yes, read, write. There is no tense marking, no nothing, no person marking here. But the only, well, tense aspect, mood, modality marker is actually this yao here, which is on the one, it's also a full verb meaning want, and then it can mark future, should, sometimes even must. Depends on context. What it means in this context, it's about how a boy should be, is supposed to be, maybe even must be. This is not new, this situation. So if you go 2,500 years back to classical Chinese, this is an example from Zhuangzi. Well, the difference now between this example and the other example, if you read, in modern Chinese, you just open whatever text and you meet radical prodrop relatively soon, so you don't need to check, read hundreds of pages to find a good example. This is the same in classical Chinese, but this one is still an extreme example, as you will see immediately when I start presenting it. Because what you have here, you have Yin Hui, who is a student, a disciple of Zhongni Confucius. So it starts with two overt nouns, Yin Hui, see Zhongni Confucius. And then it goes on. Ask for Qing Xing, leave. Ask for leave. Who asks for leave? Well, given the context that you have, let's say, a professor, a master, and a student, then it's obvious that the student has to ask for leave. So here, that first unmarked zero here must be Yin Hui. So the student asks if he, the student again, may leave, may go. Then you have Yue, say. Well, that must be the answer of the master. The master says, Xi zhi, where go? Where do you go? So we would infer the second person here, Yue, and then the student replies, Jiang, a future marker, the only tense marker here, Zhi Wei, I will go to Wei. And then he, Confucius, Yue, say again, Xi Wei Yan, what do there? And again, you have no marker here in the subject position. This, it's just to show you that this is not something new and that languages can live happily over millennia. With radical prodrop, there is nothing missing in the language. You don't need agreement and such kind of retrievability. It's not only Chinese, the same in Vietnamese, the same in Thai, the same in ever so many other languages. Now let's make a little jump. Let's go to Sapir. He is one of the famous American linguists, and in his classic book with a simple title, Language, published in 1921, he used a simple example, namely this one here, the farmer kills the duckling, to illustrate what languages actually have to mark and to what extent languages differ with regard to that. So in English, for instance, number marking is obligatory. So the farmer, obviously, we are looking at only one farmer here. Otherwise, writers or speakers would be obliged to use plural. We have to mark definiteness or indefiniteness. Here it's the farmer, it could be a farmer, but there is no neutral form. You have to make a selection here. And the same, of course, with the duckling. Here the farmer is not just killing ducklings, but it's only one, and that one is actually known from context, so it gets a definite article. We have to mark tense. There is no neuter form, verb form for that. And we have to mark person, number, agreement, and so on. This is more or less the prototypical situation in Western European languages. Now, translating that sentence into decent Chinese is actually not so simple, because this kind of out-of-the-blue sentence always sounds unnatural if you translate it. So my translation here is not bad, but Nung Min, farmer, sha si, kill, dead, perfective marker, little duckling. But what is important in this context is that somehow the issue of tense aspect needs to be addressed. If you omit that one here, the sentence would sound somehow odd. But all the other information is not there. And in that sense, then, the language is clearly different. We are entering a different linguistic world here, which is probably one of the most difficult issues. We tend to express things as speaking Western languages, which native speakers would not want to express because they are inferable from context. So Chinese leaves a lot of grammatical information to pragmatic inference from context, but that's important for me. That does not mean that there are no markers of grammatical categories, not at all. It's just we have to learn how to use them, when to use them, and how this works will be the topic of the remaining part of my presentation. When I say East and Mainland Southeast Asian languages, which I abbreviate by EMCEA, I mean Sinitic, that is Chinese with all its different, well, sometimes people say dialects, but in fact the languages, these dialects are quite different and there's no mutual intelligibility. So we have Mandarin, Cantonese, Southern Min, Hakka, 10 other such markers. And in fact, even within Hakka, there is no free intelligibility. It very much depends from where you are and what variety you speak. Then we have some Austroasiatic languages like Mon Khmer, example Vietnamese and Khmer or Cambodian. Then we have the Thai Kadai family, Thai and some 50 other languages from the same family, Zhuang, for instance, in China. The Hmong Mien, or in Chinese Miao Yao languages, Hmong, for instance, and a small number of Austronesian languages, namely the Jamic branch, which is spoken in central Vietnam. But of course, I will not address each of them, but they are similar, even though in detail, there are also differences. So what shall we do? We will look at linguistic approaches to complexity first. So I will start with a more linguistic topic now first, namely what I call overt versus hidden complexity. Then we will look at grammatical markers and how they work in hidden complexity. And we will also see that there is a somewhat different division of labor between what grammar does on the one hand and what pragmatic inference and lexicon does on the other hand. And then we will briefly look at the diachronic scenario of maturation and a few conclusions. So let's start with linguistic approaches to complexity after having had some kind of general introduction of what is going to expect you in terms of cross-linguistic differences between many East and Southeast Asian languages on the one hand and Western languages. Now, in the literature about complexity, there is usually a distinction between what is called absolute complexity and functional or relational complexity. Absolute complexity means that you have an independent, neutral, objective perspective for distinguishing how different categories are expressed. And functional or relational complexity is not absolute in the sense that the assessment of complexity depends on a certain perspective. So for instance, it depends on individuals who learn a second language. if you speak, let's say, Italian, learning Spanish might be less demanding, less complex than if you learn Chinese or if you learn Turkish or Abkhaz or Inuktitut and any of these languages, given that you simply look at the world somewhat differently when you speak such a language. So in that sense, then, absolute complexity is independent of context, whereas functional or relational complexity depends on a certain perspective. Now, absolute complexity is preferred in linguistic typology, also in recursion in the Chomskyan sense, we'll come back to this, and also in computational linguistics, but I will not address this, the Kolmogorov complexity, how much computer space you need to fully cover the information given in a text, for instance. And the functional relational complex is about costs, difficulty, how much cognitive costs does it cause to you to acquire a certain category, to learn it on the one hand, or from a cognitive perspective, to process it. There are certain linguistic structures which are better for your human parser, for your brain structure, so to speak, than other structures. And that is also reflected in typological generalizations. Me being a typologist, I'm very much interested in this kind of subject. So let's first briefly look at absolute complexity in linguistic typology. Here the focus is on formal, explicit, morphosyntactic realization of grammatical categories. A famous definition would be the one by McWhorter, 2005 here. An area of grammar is more, an area like tense, for instance, or number, an area of grammar is more complex than the same area in another grammar to the extent that it encompasses more overt distinctions and or rules than another grammar. Let's take a very simple example. You may have a language with 3 tenses, past, present, and future, and you may have another one which only makes a distinction between past and non-past, and then the past, non-past distinction is simpler because you only have 2 distinctions in contrast to the past, present, future distinction. That's the general idea behind it, and that has been used in various contexts for also coming up with some kind of general qualifications of language complexity. I don't believe in this because you will see in a minute where the problem lies, but the idea by Parkwall is they looked at WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, which is available online. If you key in WALS into your Google system, you should get there. And then here we have 144 features on the whole. And for 53 features, 53 features were represented fairly well across a large number of languages. And for these 53 features then, Parkwall and his colleagues created a complexity measure. Sometimes it's just a question of 0 or 1 complexity. For instance, one feature is, does the language have tones? If there is a tone, if there is tonality, then the value, complexity value for that feature is 1. If there is absence of tonality, you have the feature 0. Sometimes it's more complex. Inventory of consonants. There are some languages with only 6 or 7 consonants. Others have more than 100. And then they created a continuum between 0 and 1. And in the end, they added these values for all the 43 features, divided them to 43 for getting an average complexity of the languages involved. And they did that for 155 languages. And you can see Burushaski, which is a language isolate spoken in the Himalayan area, ends up as the most complex one. Another Mesoamerican language, Copainazoque. Spanish is relatively high. Italian is not there, but I mentioned Spanish because I guess Italian would be more or less at the same level. German, English is lower, Chinese is even lower, and Vietnamese is is you see rank 147, given that we have 145 languages, this is quite low. Now, the reason why I don't believe in it is that this is all arbitrary. The selection of 53 features is arbitrary. How are you going to compare complexity, global complexity of languages? In fact, there are good reasons to say that this is impossible. We don't know, even for very well-described languages, where we should finish, where grammar ends and other factors start. Take Italian, take French, take English. Of course, we have extensive descriptions, but ultimately there are always borderline cases where you would not know to what extent this is still part of the grammar. And the next question would be cross-linguistic comparability. And all of that makes it very hard to just say language X has a complexity value of 0.6 and another one, poor language, only 0.4. This simply doesn't work. But it is a good way to illustrate what is meant by overt complexity. You look at the marking system as it is from an objective perspective, and then you get at such values. The second approach is recursion. This starts out from a different idea, namely and it's basically from the natural sciences, hidden simplicity. The idea is that you need a minimal set of rules and then you apply it recursively over and over again. So for instance, sentence embedding complement sentences is very well known. So you can say, I think, and then you embed, John knows, that Peter believes, io credo che Giovanni sa, che Pietro crede, che Maria è, come si dice, è preoccupata, che Guglielmo, eccetera, eccetera. E si può continuare ad infinitum senza terminare. E questo and that is recursion. In Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch's approach, and they argue that recursion is actually the basic, what makes human languages differ from other communicative systems. They end up saying that the only difference actually lies in recursion, of course, then in their particular approach, namely merge. Merge is what makes human languages special in this context. So faculty of language in general, in a narrow sense, is characterized by this recursion. And there are other languages like Givon and Shibata, other linguists also from the typological framework, who also argue in the same way in recursion. Okay, and of course this is just to illustrate you in another domain, because we humans, we cannot only do that with language, but Chomsky would argue that we can do this with the Gioconda here only because our language is recursive. But most people dealing with these cognitive things would not believe it. And I think it's also an overemphasis of linguistic abilities there. It's probably rather the other way around, because we can think recursively, language can also be used recursively. But that's another philosophical topic we might discuss, but I'm like this kind of discussion, but we are not going into it here. Okay, so that's the absolute part, and now the cost part, the relative part is concerned, as I said, with cognitive costs for, on the one hand, processing. We have a human parser which prefers certain structures in contrast to others, and with difficulties in language acquisition, be it L1 or L2. Because we know that in individual languages, certain features are learned more easily or earlier in language acquisition than in others. For instance, plural marking or things like that are hard in German, but they are not hard in other languages because they are more regular there. And because they follow certain principles of economy, transparency, and isomorphy. I have a slide on this, but probably I don't even need to go into too much detail. The economy principle tells you that you need as few semantic categories or category combinations as possible expressed morphologically. And the transparency principle for meaning relation should be as transparent as possible. The highest transparency is attained when every single meaning is expressed in a separate form. Sometimes Turkish is described as being one of these ideal languages, even though it also comes with some complexifications there. Not everything is agglutinative in a typical in this prototypical sense, but of course you would have ev, ler, in, for instance, in Turkic. Ev is house, ler is plural, in is genitive, and then you have a separate marker for plural and for genitive, which makes processing easier. Okay. Now, each of these approaches is focused on linguistic form, namely either morphological or syntactic or both realization. There is a second type, which is now based on pragmatic inference, and I'm going to explain this in a minute in more detail. So overt complexity is related to form. How are certain grammatical, in this context, grammatical contexts realized morphologically or syntactically in an overt, perceptible way? And you have hidden complexity, in which you don't express that particular information, but you leave it to the pragmatic abilities of your interlocutor. Now, the basic idea goes back to Levinson's idea that inference is cheap and articulation is expensive. So if you articulate a certain concept, well, you have to put this into phonological, morphological, and so on substance, and that takes comparatively much more time than leaving the same information to pragmatic inference. That's the idea. So we can transport much more meaning in a much shorter time if we leave that information to pragmatic inference than if we want or if we do actually articulate this. And this leads to two forces that take influence on the grammar of a language. So on the one hand, you articulate that particular information, and that leads to the explicit expression, let's say, of a tense marker, of a pronoun, of a plural marker, whatever it is. Or you leave it to pragmatic inference, and that leads to economy. It's more economic to say nothing, but to leave it, it doesn't take less effort for you to leave that in particular information to the pragmatic abilities of the hearer. And that's a very old idea. It goes actually back to von der Gabelentz, 1891, who happened to have written not only a book about general linguistics, but also one about classical Chinese, in which he exactly describes this. So we have two motivations. One of them, you explicitly express the given information, or you leave it to the inferential abilities of your interlocutor. Heyman created the idea of competing motivations because these two motivations exclude each other. Either you be explicit or you be economic. And you always have to select between the two options. And grammars follow this principle in one way or another. I don't know whether some of you have dealt with optimality theory in linguistics, because that particular theory is exactly based on that opposition as well. So faithfulness would be explicitness, and the other one, what is the term? Well, I work with it all the time, but I forgot it at the moment. But you have these two, which are, again, in competition, and then languages make selections between these two. Well, if you have complexity, on the one hand, you have explicitness, and explicit now lead to overt complexity. And that is manifested, on the one hand, in obligatoriness. So the grammar of a language, let's say Chinese or English or Italian, X, forces the speaker to encode a certain grammatical category that exists in a given morphosyntactic environment. It is important to me that that grammatical category needs to exist in a language. So, for instance, there are languages which mark evidentiality. German, Italian do not have evidential systems. And given that, I would not say that these languages that there is hidden complexity with regard to evidentiality, because these languages don't have that particular grammatical category as it is used, or some languages don't address plural in the same way as we do. So we have to be careful here. Only if the grammatical category exists in principle in the language, then you can address the issue if it's obligatory or if it's monofunctional. What do I mean with monofunctionality? This means that a marker expresses a specific value of a given grammatical category. So one of my favorite examples is definiteness and indefiniteness. Well, in Italian, you use the definite article or you use an indefinite article, but you don't have a marker which can express both, depending on context. Well, now if you look at classifiers in Semitic languages, they can. But it comes with some additional complications, which I will not address here, because I thought it's too complex for, for explaining all of that in a short period of time. But some Semitic languages, but not only Semitic languages, Vietnamese would be the same, and many others as well. You have a classifier, and the classifier noun construction can be interpreted in terms of definiteness in one situation and in terms of indefiniteness in another situation. And then you would have two values for reference, definite or indefinite. And that would be multifunctionality. Or, of course, you can also have markers which cross different categories. So, for instance, a marker that might express aspect, but might at the same time also express some modality and so on. So that exists as well. Or just multifunctional markers which can be used, for instance, for marking benefactive or for marking causation, causativity, passive-active, or diathesis in general. The same marker having these three and often much more functions from different grammatical domains. That would be multifunctionality. But then you have hidden complexity in which there is no such obligatoriness. You have markers for grammatical categories, but you don't need to use them. The use depends on pragmatic inference. Or you have markers that can have more than one function in that sense of monofunctionality. And then the concrete situation or the interpretation depends again on the concrete situation in which a statement is made. So that's about explicitness leading to overt complexity as it is expressed by morphosyntactic form, or economy, which leaves grammatical information to the pragmatic ability, inferential abilities of speakers. And the basic idea now is that the East and mainland Southeast Asian languages, in these languages, pragmatic inference covers domains which are purely related to grammar in many other languages. And here I quote the beginning, the initial passage of Huang Yan's book on anaphora. So he says, in these pragmatic languages, meaning Chinese, Korean, by the way, and Japanese, in these pragmatic languages, many of the constraints on the allegedly grammatical processes are in fact primarily due to principles of language use rather than rules of grammatical structure. So the idea is, in a Chomskyan way, you have a grammatical structure, and from the structure you can derive meaning. And here the idea is, yeah, you can do that up to a certain extent, but not fully. Often it's pragmatic inference, and there is cross-linguistic variation there, and that is what Huang wanted to point out here. He did it particularly with regard to reflexives and interpretations of reflexive forms. What is meant by this for me is that the grammar of a language allows for simple-looking structures whose grammatical interpretation depends on pragmatic inference. So then let's look at some examples. So we have simple-looking structures, which are not so simple because there is hidden complexity in it. You need to infer what this actually meant in a given context, also in terms of grammar, not just general meaning. And we look at hidden complexity. We've looked at lack of obligatoriness already in the case of radical prodrop, so I will not bore you again with radical prodrop. But we'll look at another marker, namely the famous perfective marker le in Chinese. We will look at the use of kinship terms and pronominality in Vietnamese. There would be other examples, numeral classifiers in the context of definiteness and indefiniteness, as I've just said, the use or non-use of conjunctions, for instance, the use of reflexives, ziji, and corresponding other markers in other Southeast Asian languages, and so on and so forth. But we will just look at these two. So let's start with the Chinese perfective marker la. Well, the marker la is probably one of the most well-studied grammatical phenomena in Chinese linguistics, which doesn't necessarily mean that we fully understand it, but it's clearly a very famous marker. I give you some literature, but of course the slide would not be sufficient for listing all of it, and it's often described in terms of perfective aspect. Now, if you look at the language like Russian or modern and also classical Greek, aspect is obligatory. You cannot avoid it. There's no way. And there are rules, of course, what perfective and what imperfective means. Now, interestingly enough, as we will see in a minute, in Chinese, the perfective marker does things that are clearly associated with aspect, but it's not obligatory. And that was, for instance, for me, a long problem when I gave presentations on this topic sometimes. One of the famous examples is what is sequentialization. So this nice word here, you have a sequence of actions. Each of these actions finishes, and after it's finished, another one follows. So typically, in the morning, I get up, go to the washroom, eat my breakfast, and so on. You do these different actions. And in a typical, normal, standard average European aspect language, you would have to use the perfective aspect, which actually explicitly addresses the so-called temporal boundary, the final, the left temporal, the right-sided on the right edge, so the right temporal boundary, which states that the action is done. Now let's look at a nice example from a text. So let's probably just read here the English translation. Hua Laoshuan suddenly sat up in bed. So here, Hua Laoshuan huran suo qi shen. Now you would want to have your le, or you would want to have your le perfective aspect here from a Russian or Greek perspective. Here, nothing. So the zero is not in the strict sense of a zero as we sometimes use it. It's just to point out to you that there is no marking there. Ca zhao, let's read. He struck a match. Ca zhao huo chai, and again, nothing here. Lit the grease-covered oil lamp. What is it here? 点上变成有你的灯盏，点上 light up, nothing. 茶馆的两间屋子里便弥漫了金白的光。In the two rooms of the tea house, a ghostly light was shed. So this is, here you have your la in the end. Here and here, marked in red. And, well, why only there? One of the functions of la is to mark the climax. So you have several actions, and then you have the top one, the most important one. And in this context as well, it is. So all these things happen, and then he struck the match, lit the grease-covered oil lamp, and then there was a strange, ghostly effect coming out of this. And that strange, ghostly effect coming out of it as the climax of all these four actions is associated with the marking of la in this context. So you can do things in discourse. La has a discourse function. It marks perfective, but given that you don't have to use it all the time, it is free for discourse effects, which would not be possible in a language in which you have to mark aspect obligatorily. That is the basic idea behind it. There is a nice paper by Li Wendan. She adopts this distinction between viewpoint aspect and situation aspect in Carlotta Smith's 1997 book. Now, on the one hand, you have situation aspect, and situation aspect actually looks at the lexical side of a verb. What is the temporal structure of a particular verb? Does it have a terminal boundary, like melt, for instance? The snow melts, and at a certain stage, there is no snow anymore. This is the temporal boundary, the final temporal boundary, which is there. So in the lexical meaning, you have an inbuilt temporal boundary addressing the end state in this particular verb type, called accomplishment in this particular context. And that can be expressed in various ways, not only in Chinese, but in Chinese in particular, we have the resultative constructions which do exactly that. In these constructions, we have two verbs, serial verb construction. The first one denotes the general event, activity, and the second one addresses the result. So you have something like kan, meaning see, and the result, there is clarity. Kan qing chu, see something clearly. Or xue, you learn, and at the end you hui, you are able to do something. Learn. We would translate it by learn, but in fact you have two elements here. You have xue as learning, which as such doesn't have a temporal boundary, but with hui, you reach a certain stage. Now you know. And you have the directions. I won't go into the other ones. There would be other lexical means of expressing situation aspect. And viewpoint aspect, on the other hand, corresponds exactly to what we find in the prototypical perfective-imperfective distinctions as we find it in aspectual systems of Russian, other Slavonic languages, modern and classical Greek, and many others. And also up to a certain extent, I think, passato, passato remoto in Italian, and so on. Now, interestingly enough, if we look at the same example again, in the Chinese example which I've just presented to you, you might have realized that there in this context you have zuo and qi, ca and zhao, dian and zhang. You always have two verbs. The second one is a resultative. And if you take that same sentence now and if you omit the resultative, it doesn't work. So if you have 花老栓忽然搓神，擦火柴，点变成有你的登场插管的两江屋子里 and so on, then the sentence is odd. You may want to say it's ungrammatical. From a perspective of pragmatics, you would probably rather say it's pragmatically odd, but it's certainly not good. So what seems to be the case is that you don't need to address the issue of the final temporal or the terminal temporal boundary by using the perfective marker le, but you do it lexically. You add one of the relevant V2 second verbs. And then this already shows that there is a temporal boundary there, and that lexical information is sufficient. You would not want or would not need, depending on context, to use the viewpoint aspect in this context. And that is the idea. So if lexical aspect is sufficient and mostly obligatory, overt marking of grammatical aspect is free for all sorts of discourse purposes. When I said it's about reaching the climax or the peak clause, this is just one small issue. It's not the whole story. The whole thing depends on foregrounding and backgrounding, and it's also associated with other features, namely transitivity features and the context of the clause. But that would keep us busy for more than an hour if I only would try to explain Li Wen Dan, not to speak about saying more about it, how it works. So the idea is then, in this case, you have a marker Le, which does something very similar to perfective aspect, maybe not 100%, but yeah, it does. It addresses the boundary, the temporal boundary structure of a language, but the obligatoriness of that marker depends on all sorts of discourse factors. On the other hand, you can express, or even you must express somehow the same thing, but you use lexical means. You use, in the case I've just presented to you, the resultative construction. Now, the resultative construction is very complex in Chinese. You have a large number of possible V1s, and you have a large number of possible V2s, and they are by no means freely combinable. In fact, you also express detailed semantic differences in selecting one V2 in contrast to another V2, and sometimes, as in the very famous example, Chi Bao, eat to one fill, you basically just have that. Chi is your verb 1, and then if you want to say that you are full, you use Bao, and that's it. He Bao works as well, but these two and no more. So there is a lot of detailed lexical rules. And then the complexity is not so much in grammar, but in lexical selections. In the what particular V2 am I going to select, and what particular meaning am I going to transport. Maybe there is a certain similarity if you look at Russian and other languages with aspect, where you have different selections of preverbs, and the preverbs also come with a certain meaning. They are prepositions initially, and they also address specific meanings. But I think here the complexity is much larger to a certain extent, and of course, in the case of Russian, you would have to use one of these prepositions, and it's often simply lexically clarified which one you can use. So that was what I wanted to say about the perfective marker Le. Now let's look at a completely different example, kinship terms and their pronominal functions. Now, for that purpose, we look at Vietnamese. Vietnamese has prototypical personal pronouns, and prototypical means that pronouns by definition address person, first, second, and third person. So you have toi and tao for formal and informal I. You have my, informal you. You have markers for third and third singular and plural. But what is often used are kinship terms. There would also be other things. You could also use titles, professor, general, or president, or whatever. But I'm doing this now here with kinship terms. So, for instance, not every kinship term can be used outside of the family context, but the ones I list here, following Huynh, Yun, Huynh, well, Vietnamese, and Yun, Korean, by the way, but this is about Vietnamese. So you have anh, elder brother, chị, elder sister, em, younger sibling, cháu, bác, con, chú, cô. So younger sibling, grandchild, uncle, child, uncle from father's side, auntie, father's side, and so on. And these can not only be used for addressing family members, but basically everybody. Well, basically. Now, what we can see here is that there is no, if you use this, and I'm going to show this with examples in a minute, there is no clear-cut distinction between address and reference. So is it you or is it a third person? then there is the selection of a pronoun with the dative properties, marking first, second, third person explicitly, is not necessarily less polite than the use of kinship terms, as we will see. So politeness issues are coming in there as well. Kinship terms in that use are two-place predicates. They are relational, as we will see in a minute. And the speaker then, being relational, addresses or assesses him or herself to the in terms of age and generation hierarchy, and a few other aspects as well. Social position in general, depending on the context. So let's start with the first part, no clear-cut distinction between address and reference. This example is relatively famous. It's from Leung, 1990, and he presents this example here. Mẹ đã mua cho bố cây mũ hôm qua. So, mẹ, mother, perfective marker, by, for father. Here the classifier used for marking definiteness. Mũ is hat and hôm qua is yesterday. So you have mẹ, mother, and bố, father. And now depending on context, mẹ could be I. So if mother is actually uttering that sentence, it means I bought the cat for instance, father. If she says this in the presence of the child, she might say this to the father of the child. But if the father is speaking, it might be you, mother, bought the hat for me. Or I bought the hat for father if father is not present and if the mother is speaking. Or mother bought the hat for me if the father is speaking and the mother is not there. Then it would be third person, as in the case of father here, and a few other contexts. So the context is whether it's first, second, third person. So speaker, addressee and reference, third person, depends on context. Of course, this is an extreme, somehow constructed example, but in principle, these are the options you have. So using a kinship term might be first, second, third person. And then there is another thing, as I said, about politeness. When we looked at these examples here, there was a distinction between toi formal and tao informal, I said. But selecting this has not necessarily much to do with, well, it has to do with politeness. But for instance, if I'm among my colleagues, my friends, we are drinking beer together, and I talk about myself by using toi, this is rather uncommon, of course. We are, to be familiar, I would talk about myself as tao. And in the same, in addressing my friends or my colleagues, I would use my, not, well, in this case, we don't have a formal higher form, but still you would use that one. So in fact, pronouns can on the one hand create distance. If I use them the wrong way, if I talk about, if I use toi with my friends, then I create distance. But they can also express solidarity. And that depends again on context. About kinship terms, they are two-place predicates. So there is a speaker who assesses him or herself in the discourse situation, speech situation. And if that person talks about herself as M, younger sibling, then this automatically has an effect on the other, because it's a relation between two, speaker and interlocutor, speaker and hearer, speaker and addressee. So then the addressee could be either anh, elder brother, or chị, elder sister. A typical shop situation. So the speaker is a younger female, the seller, and we have an addressee, an elder female customer. And now the speaker, the female seller, addresses that elderly lady by chị, elder sister. Lứa áo đấy hông? Do you like striped jackets? And then the speaker goes on saying, em lấy ra cho chị lứa I'll take them out for you to choose. And then M is the speaker, younger sibling, I, for you, elder sister. So that's how these discourse situations work. Now, the interesting thing is Vietnamese is a radical pro-drop language. That's how it is described. But in discourse, particularly in dialogue, for reasons of politeness having nothing to do with grammar, you might actually not find very many incidences of radical pro-drop, because radical pro-drop would be rude in this context if you don't address the relation in a normal. Of course, if everything is clear who is doing what to whom, then you may still drop it. But given that politeness issue, creating familiarity by using kinship terms, you may decide not to use radical pro-drop for reasons of politeness. And then this means if one would like to do statistics simply on the presence or absence, you do not justice to how these pronominal elements are used. And that's actually the same, I think, in Chinese and many others. There are many social and so on aspects that come in with if you speak a radical pro-drop language, you can do all sorts of things with these elements which you cannot do if you have to obligatorily use your pronominal marking. So then kinship terms in pronominal use. Again, you have grammar, you have social deixis, but what is open here is first, second, third person. Obligatoriness, whether you use a marker or not, depends on discourse. And then these things, if you use kinship terms, are multifunctional because they could be first, second, and third person. But once you decide to mark, you use a pronoun or a pronominal element, you have your lexicon. You have to make a selection from a rather large number of options. And as I've said, it's not only the kinship terms, it could also be functional terms like president, like general, Mr. Whatever kind of depending. And this is actually one Vietnamese student once showed me a nice regulation of how you have to address your superiors in military service, because there would be many options, and then the government decided we are going to regulate that to avoid complications and so on. So this could be extremely complex, and then lexicon is coming in. The selection of the actual lexical item for expressing what is expressed by pronouns is much more complex than one would expect it from a Western perspective. So that's as much as I wanted to show. Let's look briefly at the diachronic scenario. How do these things evolve? And for that perspective, I would briefly like to introduce the concept of maturation. This term was introduced by Dalla, a Swedish typologist, and he defines maturation as follows: the accumulation of material in a grammar G of a language that did not exist at an earlier stage G1 of that language. So you have languages develop over time. And in the process of such developments, they add all sorts of complications, old forms that get partly lost but not fully, but then are replaced by other markers, and all of that creates a type of overt complexity which typically comes in with complex word structure. You have inflectional markers, you have derivational, and you have incorporating morphology, which we don't have in standard average European, but in many other languages you have it. You have grammatical gender, which is often irregular. There are certain irregularities, but you have to know that a table is feminine in Italian and in German, but it's probably not in other languages. We have inflectional classes. Take Latin, where you have amicus, amica, spiritus, res, and of course the consonantal ones. These are just additional complications for different markings. You have syntactic phenomena like agreement on the verb. You have sometimes specific marking of subordinate clauses. You have all sorts of morphophonological issues The list here is by no means complex. Dahl lists some, I think, 15 or 16 different such features, which are typical of maturation in the sense that languages over time acquire many sub-distinctions and sub-sub-distinctions which add to complexity. But the type of complexity he looks at is an overt complexity. So we have a state of a grammar X, and if explicitness wins, over time you get more and more complex morphosyntax-based maturity. You get an overt complexity type complexity. If, on the other hand, economy wins, you further develop your pragmatics-based maturity, and that leads to hidden complexity. And my general idea would somehow be that, that there was this hypothesis, is Chinese a pidgin or a Creole language? Not many sinologists would agree to that, but McWhorter argued in such a way. What happened, in my view, is that you have just centuries and millennia of development in a system that in principle favors pragmatics, but on the other hand, you of course develop at the lexical level and all sorts of intermediate levels rather complex systems. And that would not be the case in Creole languages, for instance. So in that way, I would argue what we have in this language is a general tendency to use economy. But of course, one should not generalize. One should look at each construction, and then it's the sheer number of constructions that follow that principle that make general conclusions possible. So in East and Mainland Southeast Asian languages, economy wins to the extent that they have reached a degree of pragmatics-based maturity or hidden complexity across many domains of grammar, which is rarely seen elsewhere in the world. And they are characterized by in terms of obligatoriness and multifunctionality. But of course, there are also contrary developments. For instance, we have Sinitic languages with obligatory case marking. We have tense aspect inflection in Sinitic up to a certain extent. And we have person number marking on the verb in Hmong Khmer languages in the Aslian family, for instance. I will not elaborate on that too much, but there are many Jin and Mandarin languages in which you have obligatory case marking. So this example from Tangwang, for instance, Hua, Ne, Na, Ne is you, Na is the dative marker, Yangzi, Yangru, Yangru, Ha is the accusative marker, Tan La is the instrumental, Coal, Kokiche, roast applicative imperfective, I roast lamb to him with coal. And these markers are obligatory. You cannot omit the accusative here. It's not even like Turkic or Mongolic, where you have differential object marking, where you do not always mark accusative. Here, you always have to mark the accusative, irrespective of whether the object is definite or indefinite. And this is can somehow be explained by this Qinghai Gansu Sprachbund, where languages, Turkic languages, Mongolic languages, and Amdo-Tibetan are in permanent contact. And how this in detail works is actually the topic of a lot of research nowadays. You also have certain languages in which you have two forms on the verb. So what is gai in Chinese would be gai and ge in the Xunxian Mandarin variety of Henan. This has been described very nicely by Arcodia in two papers in 2013 and 15, where he summarized a lot of the literature on this topic. So you would have, the meeting was moved to tomorrow in a perfective form. You would use ge here. In another imperfective way, you would probably use gai. And then that creates a situation maybe somewhat similar to sing-sang. But of course, in sing-sang, you have temporal distinctions. Here, you have aspect distinctions. Problem with this is, but there's also a problem of the quality of the data, and the description of qualitative, the quality of the description given. these two forms are the result of, again, of resultative constructions. So you have two constructions, let's say a verb finishing in la, or cha, or tao, or shang as either your perfective or durative marker, or a resultative second verb. And then the two syllables are matched into one, fused into one syllable, and that creates the two different markings. Problem is that, at least as far as the specifications in the literature goes, it seems that both forms remain multifunctional in various ways. One would like to know more. But maybe it's also a property of if a language of that type develops morphology at an initial stage, there is still some kind of multifunctionality which might get lost at a later stage of the language. Given time, we may drop this one and we may come to the conclusion after you're patient. So I wanted to show you that there are two types of complexity, hidden versus overt, and that they are associated with explicitness in the economy. And the idea is that East and Main and Southeast Asian languages are actually characterized more by hidden complexity in comparison to overt complexities. And that there are cross-linguistic differences in the interaction of grammar with pragmatic inference and the lexicon. And in a diachronic process, you might have two different ways of maturation, one based on explicitness, leading to all sorts of complexification at the overt level, and the economy-based maturation. To conclude, I would like to do something which is a bit special, having to do with large language models, because it's sometimes my hobby. I didn't do it systematically, but to key in some of these Chinese examples where you have relatively little information, and then try to see how the translation fares. If you translate the same sentence into, or the same, well, it's not always a single sentence, it's often a sequence of sentences or a sequence of clauses. So we have a source language with comparatively high degree of hidden complexity, and the target language in which you translate the text, it has comparatively high degree of overt complexity. So the machine, the large language model, has to add grammatical information, which is by no means retrievable from what is given in the original. So if you key in this one, his father did actually not approve that he stayed at home and so on. You remember the sentence? I did this 2 days ago again. So his father did not favor him to stay in the house all day to read and write. That's good. That boys should be naughty, go out to see the world, and then somehow the system gets lost. White social, the world, to be a writer, do not think. And in Italian fares better actually. Suo padre non era favorevole al fatto che rimanesse, of course there is no rimanesse, condizione passato in the Chinese original, but somehow it's good. So the system managed to do this. In casa tutto il giorno a leggere e a scrivere, so they use an infinitive there, which is good. Che I ragazzi dovessero essere cattivi. Of course, everything that has to do with agreement and so on needs to be taken, that information needs to come from elsewhere once you do the translation. Uscire per vedere il mondo, avere un'ampia socialità. But then maybe sfondare nel mondo is still okay. But essere uno scrittore non lo pensavo. Yeah, I don't quite know, but I think as an Italian native speaker, you would like to know a bit more about what essere uno scrittore non lo pensavo would mean in that context. So at that stage, you may want to have more in who actually thinks that somebody should probably rather not become a writer. But you can see, of course, these systems, they work completely differently. They don't care about pragmatic inference at all. They take this information, whatever it is. System fares fairly well very often. But I think in some cases, particularly if it comes to assessing additional categories that are necessary in the target language, maybe particularly also retrieving of co-reference things, you still face some problems. And that is how I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you for your patience and for your attention. E allora possiamo discutere in inglese, in italiano, English, Italian. Domande, chiarificazioni forse?
La grammaticalizzazione è veramente un aspetto linguistico importante, interessante, perché i nostri studenti che studiano coreano sicuramente si saranno fatti questa domanda, perché in coreano abbiamo delle regole grammaticali, però ci sono tante forme grammaticali che sono un po' particolari, non esistono in italiano. Mi viene in mente perché la lingua coreana è proprio un esempio rampante dove avviene frequentemente la grammaticalizzazione di alcuni elementi grammaticali. Ad esempio il verbo vedere, vi ricordate 보다, il verbo vedere perde il suo significato principale, che è vedere, quando viene utilizzato insieme ad altri verbi. Diventa un verbo ausiliare per marcare tentativo, esperienza. Questo è diventato grammaticalizzato, cioè avviene questa grammaticalizzazione. Questo è solo un esempio che mi è venuto in mente, ma anche a livello fonetico, anche per quanto riguarda i suffissi onorifici, alcune particelle, suffissi, tanti elementi linguistici fanno parte di questo fenomeno di grammaticalizzazione, quindi è molto interessante vedere il coreano anche da questo punto di vista. Prima guardavo Hidden Complexity, sicuramente il coreano appartiene a questa lingua dove è nascosta la complessità, perché insomma, per ovvi motivi, quello che abbiamo visto è molto interessante. In un'ora non è semplice spiegare.
Ma mi pare che, per esempio, in giapponese, ma anche in coreano, una forma minima in giapponese deve consistere dalla radice e un marcatore di tempo.
Sì.
Mi pare che in coreano è piuttosto la cortesia, forse,
sì,
perché il sistema di cortesia è ancora un po' più complesso del sistema giapponese, ma dopo ci sono altre possibilità. E un collega, un linguista specialista che diventa specialista di coreano, che anche mi dice che che c'è una gran varietà di marcatori di evidenzialità, per esempio questo vedere che diventa qualcosa come per l'interpretazione di aver visto.
Sì, perché letteralmente,
molto rinomato.
Sì, letteralmente significa provare a andare. Perché provare a andare?
Sì, però, il temimasho in giapponese, vamos a ver, andiamo a vedere, ma che è un conativo in quel senso.
Sì.
Ma quello che mi pare interessante è soprattutto queste forme di modalità, di evidenzialità, eccetera, non sono esattamente obbligatori, però dipende del registro. In un testo, un contesto giornalistico, è importante di aggiungere queste informazioni. Da dove viene la informazione? Qual è l'assesso? Qual è l'interpretazione sulla veracità di una certa informazione? E qui normalmente in giapponese e forse anche in coreano si deve prendere posizione in un modo molto più alto che diciamo in una lingua europea. E a volte è molto interessante di leggere come si quotano i statement di President Trump, eccetera, perché c'è un assessment. Chiaramente il giornalista può offrire, usando certi marcatori, esattamente cosa pensa.
È vero, perché spesso non è obbligatorio, quindi questi elementi grammaticali non vengono studiati come parte della grammatica, ma più nella pragmatica, cioè proprio perché non è...
Ma fanno parte di un paradigma lungo. C'è un verbo e dopo qualche 10-15 posizioni dove si possono mettere questi marcatori seguendo una certa regolarità. E così c'entra la grammatica.
Sì, io non conosco vietnamita cinese, ma c'erano tanti esempi interessanti, vero? Quindi, tu volevi dire qualcosa?
Due cose. Grazie mille dell'intervento. Il concetto di hidden complexity è molto utile e non conoscevo la letteratura che c'era dietro, per cui mi interessa moltissimo questo. Non sapevo che Parkval 2008 avesse comparato così tante lingue. Poi ha fatto un articolo molto simile solo sull'esperanto, ma non è andato a guardare la complessità, ma solo la collocazione tipologica. Quindi non è l'ha visto in un altro modo con le features del waltz. Quindi questo è interessante. Andrò a vedermi l'altro articolo che è precedente. Quindi l'articolino dell'esperanto è più piccolo, chiaramente.
Infine sarebbe facile di fare lo stesso con quei 53 features tratti per dopo vedere dove situare.
Ma è quello che ha fatto, però nell'articolo non li ha usati per una metrica complessità semplicità, ma per tipologia. E quindi questo l'ho trovato molto interessante, come se non catturassero qualcosa. Quindi questa era un'osservazione. Un'altra osservazione, che l'esempio mi ha intrigato all'inizio, allora mi sono messo a tradurlo in esperanto mentre parlavi. Sì?
Facciamo forse questo.
Sì, esatto, questo è il migliore. Ho provato a... E l'ultima parte è quella a cui ho avuto difficoltà, perché ho dovuto deviare dal modello cinese, perché altrimenti non ce la facevo, perché non potevo riferirmi chiaramente al padre. Ho dovuto ripetere una cosa, magari poi te lo faccio vedere se così, per pura curiosità.
Abbiamo fatto anche un esperimento con una studente, allora professore di linguistica cinese in Cina, comparando, costruendo sequenze di 3 clausole. E il nostro interesse era a che punto perdono la fila i tedeschi da una parte e i cinesi dall'altra parte. La situazione non è così facile, ma c'è una differenza che si può vedere, ma perché questo articolo è in processo di riferimento, non l'ho presentato qui, ma mostra che ci sono differenze tra la maniera nella quale queste cose vengono percepite in un contesto cinese in comparazione al diciamo, tedesco, forse anche italiano, ma l'italiano è forse ancora un po' differente a causa del suo mild proto, delle sue proprietà mild proto.
E poi un'altra piccola osservazione as a computer scientist, on the very last slide, DeepL is not a large language model.
That's right.
That's true. It's a machine translation tool, and technically it's a combination translation model plus language model, so it's different. And I think that that's very interesting, the error that it makes, because for the long dependency, it's very distant. So statistically speaking, you cannot with trigrams go until there. You can guess injecting some specific rules, hoping for the best, but that's all that you can. So it's a specific limitation of the algorithm from that.
Io direi lo stesso, è un problema di come si dice,
Impredictable, qualcosa del genere.
Di predictibilità, sì.
Sì, non si può, proprio matematicamente non ce la fai.
No.
Proprio non ce la fai.
Queste lingue ci sono a volte, e non soltanto nel cinese. Io una volta ho imparato un po' di Manju, e soprattutto i testi storici sono molto interessanti perché sono sequenze di eventi, ma chiaro col prodromo. E per un lettore il problema consiste nel vedere, nel comprendere chi ha fatto che cosa in una certa clausola, in una certa situazione. Se il cano X ha fatto qualcosa col cano, eccetera, eccetera. Per i lettori del tempo era normale, non avevano dei problemi di interpretazione, però per noi li abbiamo.
C'è cambiato il contesto.
Mi pare che forse non ci sono abbastanti testi in Manju. Fare una tale traduzione, ci mancherebbe di testo, ed anche se ci fossero abbastanti testi, sì, è il problema della distanza,
esatto,
che è enormemente difficile, e forse si sviluppano i lettori, dipendente dalla lingua, una certa capacità di automaticamente inferire l'interpretazione adeguata.
Sì, conoscenza enciclopedica del parlante, della comunità.
Eccetera. Sì. Ma si può avere anche questa esperienza.
Qualcun altro? Grazie mille, davvero molto interessante. Sì. Mi veniva in mente, studiando delle grammatiche russe, una grammatica russa del cinese di Bichurin, non so se la conosce, Jakob Bichurin. E a proposito di questa hidden complexity, in fondo, lui spiegava il meccanismo del cinese come, lui diceva, изменение умственные, cioè modifiche mentali, cambiamenti mentali, che il cinese operava ed era molto interessante. Questo è un testo appunto del 1835, quindi si interrogava su come poteva funzionare il meccanismo della lingua e quindi la spiegava con questo lavoro mentale. Sembrava interessante.
È un lavoro mentale, e forse è il primo che aveva forse notato questa cosa era von der Kabelens, che ha detto che ci sono due motivazioni, der Bequemlichkeitstrieb, come si dice, la pigrizia, in quel caso che corrisponde all'economia, e l'altro caso che non ricordo l'altro, ma lui era il primo che aveva introdotto questa differenza qua, tra le due modi di spiegarsi. Ma il problema è naturalmente come, se parliamo della cognizione umana, come veramente provarlo, mostrarlo, anche misurarlo fino a un certo grado con gli apparecchi che ci sono oggi, con EEG, eccetera, eccetera. E qui è difficile, soprattutto questi esperimenti col marcatore zero, perché anche i pronomi, lui, chiaro c'è una differenza lei e lui, e noi per esempio facendo questo esperimento, comparando tedesco e cinese in una clausola tedesca è necessario di avere un soggetto, e questo soggetto può essere pronominale, ma allora ci sono le tre forme, e per questo abbiamo selezionato soltanto nomi maschili, e dopo er, he, lui, per simulare fino a un certo grado questa situazione, e facendo così si mostravano qualche differenze che sono forse caratteristiche, ma che hanno non soltanto qualcosa a fare con, diciamo, la grammatica, ma anche con effetti di testo e di costruzione di testualità. Infatti non è soltanto questo che si discute normalmente nel contesto linguistico, ancora la struttura del testo in un modo più generale ha una certa importanza.
Altre domande? Commenti?
Una piccola provocazione.
Allora,
abbiamo parlato di complessità.
Sì.
Spesso, soprattutto quando si tratta di mutamento linguistico, quindi di diacronia, penso, non so, dico anche per gli studenti, per esempio, quando si parla della diacronia latino-romanza, quindi, non so, la perdita, per esempio, della marcatura di caso, si parla di semplificazione. Dove sta in questo sistema la semplificazione, e ha ancora valore questo concetto in linguistica? Io sono molto critica, dico sempre che, dico agli studenti, quando nella lingua si semplifica un aspetto, se ne complica sempre un altro, quindi se si semplifica un livello c'è una complicazione ad un altro livello. Così, una provocazione, per sapere cosa ne pensi.
Non è una provocazione, è una domanda molto importante, ma utilizzando primo la complessità aperta di overt complexity, in quel senso c'è una semplificazione, perché, diciamo, i 4 valori del nominativo, accusativo, genitivo, eccetera, si perde. Allora c'è semplicità. Nel caso delle lingue romanze ci sono i preposizioni, eccetera, che possono creare un altro modo di esprimere, si contribuiscono all'overt complexity in un altro punto, ma per esempio la differenza tra la marcazione dell'oggetto e del soggetto rimane 0. C'è soltanto per l'oggetto indiretto, per esempio, che allora si esprime con una preposizione. Nel spagnolo c'è ancora la differential object marking, eccetera, eccetera, tutte queste differenze, ma tutto questo si sviluppa nel sistema di un sistema aperto, overt complexity. Non lasciamo forse in un modo stretto questa differenza, e questo è un altro problema, la sintattocentrificazione, qualcosa del genere in italiano. In italiano c'è ancora la sintassi che domina fino a un certo modo, ma anche in interazione naturalmente con la pragmatica, con la posizione del topico, eccetera, eccetera. L'italiano è molto famoso per le sue possibilità di topicalizzazione, focalizzazione, eccetera, ma sempre siamo a livello aperto. Il problema non c'è sempre un trade-off tra la perdita di complessità. A volte sì, c'è anche l'idea che forse si perde la complessità morfologica, che dopo viene ricompensato a livello della sintasi, eccetera, eccetera. Ma queste regole non funzionano così, non è così semplice. Il problema è finalmente che non possiamo misurare la overall complexity, ciò che si chiama a volte complessità globale di una lingua. Possiamo dire che l'italiano forse ha questo fattore 0,6 o qualcosa del genere, mentre che l'Inuktitut ha forse 0,9. Non è possibile. E perciò è anche difficile di misurare, diciamo, questi effetti di compensazione. Ma il problema è che lo sviluppo, la grammaticalizzazione normalmente si fa a un livello specifico. C'è una marcazione di futuro che sta sviluppandosi, c'è un'altra cosa che sta sviluppandosi e questa forma non si interessa di un sistema più ampio e per questo normalmente la grammaticalizzazione si sviluppa fino a un certo grado indipendentemente di quei problemi più generali della misurazione della complessità. E io personalmente direi che sì, la complessità è utile per descrivere certi fatti più generali, ma per comprendere in dettaglio quello che succede, che si fa in una lingua, è un'altra cosa. Ci sono fattori differenti che dobbiamo anche considerare. Non funzionerebbe mai. E io direi anche la predittibilità di certe altre proprietà, nel senso tipologico e nel senso di se una lingua è verbo primo o verbo secondo, verbo finale, eccetera. Non si può dire niente con questo sistema. Forse sì, c'è questa idea di che una lingua SOV deve avere una possibilità di distinguere la gente e il paziente, perché se ci sono due nomi, sì, ma è una idea astratta perché normalmente se osserviamo quante volte si trovano frase SOV in un testo, ci renderemo conto che non è molto, questa costruzione completa è rara. Normalmente si utilizza il soggetto se necessario, si utilizza l'oggetto se necessario, si utilizza niente. E per questo questa idea di compensazione forse non è adeguata per lo sviluppo diacronico, ma avendo detto questo è interessante che certe lingue mi parono essere più al lato hidden che altre lingue. Possono fare a meno di un certo marcatore. Il problema è che anche nel Cino antico non possiamo dire veramente qual era la morfologia. C'è una certa ricostruzione, come sappiamo, Baxter e Sagar, e anche nella tradizione cinese ci sono, ma questa morfologia è normalmente non una morfologia flessionale. La morfologia, se si può ricostruire, non è congruenza, non è caso, si tratta piuttosto di morfologia derivazionale e di nient'altro.
Bene, mi sa che l'hai proprio provocato perché possiamo andare così per ore, ma ahimè dobbiamo terminare il seminario. Lo ringraziamo ancora.